Cedar Valley Medical Center, nestled in the heart of a bustling city neighborhood, was widely known for its top-tier healthcare services and polished reputation. But beneath its spotless image, an unexpected storm was brewing. When Jasmine Rivers, an experienced and ambitious nurse of mixed heritage, joined the team, she had no inkling of the entrenched biases she was about to face. Meanwhile, a seemingly unremarkable patient, Samuel Clark, lay quietly in his hospital room, observing the unfolding events. Yet, Samuel wasn't just another face in the ward. His silent presence held a profound significance that would soon unravel. How could one woman's perseverance spark a seismic shift in an entire institution? Let's uncover the story. Before we begin, share where you're tuning in from, and if you enjoy captivating tales of courage and transformation, hit that subscribe button for more. As Jasmine stepped into the polished corridors of Cedar Valley Medical Center, the gleaming floors reflected the overhead lights with a sterile perfection. The faint chemical tang of antiseptics hung in the air, mingled with an unspoken tension that sent a shiver down her spine. Ignoring the unease creeping through her, Jasmine squared her shoulders, her resolve firm. First impressions were everything, and she was determined to make hers count. Approaching the nurse's station, she was greeted by an unsettling shift in the room's energy. Conversations tapered off, replaced by murmurs barely above whispers. Eyes darted in her direction only to hurriedly look away, as though her presence alone demanded avoidance. She swallowed her discomfort, focusing on maintaining her poise. "Excuse me," Jasmine said, her voice steady despite the rising anxiety. "I'm Jasmine Rivers, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the supervisor's office?" A brunette with striking green eyes glanced up, her expression briefly startled before slipping into a polite yet distant smile. "Down the hall," she replied, her tone courteous but tinged with cool detachment. "Second door on the left." Jasmine nodded in thanks and walked away, feeling the weight of every gaze tracking her movement. The rhythmic sound of her footsteps echoed down the corridor, each step amplified in the charged silence, as though the walls themselves were listening. As she approached the office, a tall, dignified man stepped out of a nearby room. His crisp white coat, neatly trimmed silver hair, and commanding presence marked him as a senior physician. Jasmine's heart lifted slightly. Perhaps this could be an opportunity to establish a positive rapport. "Good morning, doctor," she said warmly, offering a bright smile. "I'm Jasmine Rivers, the new nurse starting today. It's a pleasure to meet you." The man's piercing blue eyes flicked over her with a detached air, his expression unreadable. "Dr. Leonard Hayes," he replied briskly. "I assume you've been thoroughly briefed on the hospital's procedures." Jasmine opened her mouth to respond, but Dr. Hayes continued without waiting for an answer. "Cedar Valley upholds rigorous standards. I trust you're ready to meet them." Before she could utter another word, he strode past her, his clipped steps echoing in the corridor. Jasmine was left standing there, her hand falling slowly to her side. The encounter stung, but she refused to let it dim her resolve. Drawing a deep breath, she straightened her posture and knocked firmly on the door of the supervisor's office. As she waited for a response, her thoughts wandered to her years in nursing school. Her mother's voice rang in her mind, a blend of pride and caution. "My girl," her mother had said, her words carrying equal parts encouragement and warning. "You're going to have to work twice as hard as anyone else. But don't you ever let them see you falter. You come from a line of strong women, and that strength runs in you too." Jasmine recalled the late nights spent poring over textbooks, the endless hours of clinical rotations, and the constant need to prove her worth. She remembered the skeptical glances from some instructors, the murmured doubts when she excelled, and the whispers questioning her place in the program. Yet she had risen above it all, graduating with honors and earning the respect of even her most doubtful peers. Now, standing in the pristine halls of Cedar Valley, she drew from that well of inner fortitude. She had faced challenges before, and she would do so again. The door swung open, revealing a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an expression of no-nonsense authority. "Ms. Rivers, I assume," the woman said, her tone brisk and devoid of warmth. "Come in. We have a lot to go over, and I expect you to keep up." Jasmine stepped into the office, feeling as though she were walking into something far more significant than just a new role. The hospital seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible tension, an undercurrent of unease hidden beneath polished professionalism and sparkling floors. A quiet storm was gathering, its presence felt even if unseen. Jasmine couldn't have known that her arrival would soon become the spark for transformation at Cedar Valley, challenging ingrained biases and exposing the harmful culture buried under the institution's spotless reputation. The rest of her first day passed in a blur of orientations, countless introductions, and an overwhelming stack of forms to complete. As Jasmine moved through the hospital's bustling corridors, she began to notice patterns that were hard to ignore. Conversations seemed to falter when she approached, picking back up in muted tones as she walked away. Her attempts to connect with fellow nurses were met with polite but detached responses, their smiles courteous but lacking any real warmth. The exclusion was subtle yet undeniable, leaving Jasmine feeling like an outsider in a place where teamwork should have been paramount. By the time her shift ended, she was emotionally drained, her mind clouded by the weight of unspoken judgments. As she packed her belongings in the staff locker room, a hushed conversation reached her ears from just around the corner. "Did you see the new hire?" one voice whispered. "Yeah," came the reply, low and filled with implication. "I'm not sure what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the right place for, you know." Jasmine's hand froze mid-motion, her fingers gripping the edge of the locker door. Her stomach sank. She had hoped the chilly reception earlier was just nerves or first-day awkwardness, but now it was impossible to ignore. The reality was stark. This wasn't simply a fresh start. It was going to be a relentless battle against preconceived notions and thinly veiled biases. As she left the hospital, the day's events bore down on her like a heavy weight. The excitement and optimism she had felt that morning had been replaced by an aching sense of isolation and doubt. At the bus stop, Jasmine sank onto the hard bench, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She pulled her phone from her bag and dialed the one number she knew would bring her some semblance of comfort. After 2 rings, a familiar, soothing voice answered, "Hi, sweetheart. How was your first day?" Hearing her mother's voice, Jasmine felt a lump rise in her throat, and tears sting her eyes. She took a deep, unsteady breath, determined not to let her emotions spill over in public. "It was tough, Mom," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. For a moment, the line was silent. Then her mother spoke, her tone a mix of compassion and unwavering strength. "Jasmine Elaine Rivers, listen to me," her mother said firmly. "You've worked far too hard to let anyone make you feel small. Remember who you are and the legacy you carry. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every young girl who dreams of walking those halls someday." Jasmine closed her eyes, letting her mother's words settle over her like a warm blanket. "I know, Mom," she said softly. "It's just, I didn't think it would be this hard." "Anything worth doing is never easy, honey," her mother replied gently. "But you've got the strength of generations behind you. Keep your head up, do your job with excellence, and don't you ever let them see you stumble." "Do you hear me?" "Yes, Mom," Jasmine said, her voice steadier now. "I hear you." As she ended the call, Jasmine noticed a sleek black sedan gliding past the bus stop. Through its tinted windows she caught a brief glimpse of Dr. Hayes. His gaze met hers for an instant before the car sped off into the night. Straightening her shoulders, Jasmine replayed her mother's words in her mind. The road ahead might be steep, but she wasn't climbing it alone. She carried with her the strength of her family and her own unshakable resolve. As the bus pulled into the stop, she rose to her feet, ready to face whatever challenges Cedar Valley would throw her way. Little did Jasmine know. Her arrival at Cedar Valley Medical Center would ignite a chain of events that would challenge the very fabric of the hospital's culture. Deep-seated prejudices, long buried beneath the surface, were about to be exposed, forcing a long-overdue reckoning. The weeks that followed unfolded like a slow-burning fuse, each day adding another layer of tension to Jasmine's already demanding work environment. The initial frosty reception she experienced had morphed into a more insidious form of exclusion, subtle, hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. As Jasmine conducted her morning rounds, the contrast in how she was treated compared to her colleagues became glaringly obvious. Dr. Leonard Hayes, in particular, seemed to go out of his way to scrutinize her work, his criticism sharp and relentless, no matter how meticulous she was. "Nurse Rivers," Dr. Hayes called out one morning, his voice cutting through the bustling activity of the nurses' station. "I trust you've finally familiarized yourself with our protocols?" The way he lingered on the word "finally" sent a chill down Jasmine's spine. She turned to face him, her expression calm and composed, refusing to let him see her falter. "Of course, Dr. Hayes," she replied, her tone steady. "I assure you, I'm well versed in all hospital procedures." Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We'll see about that," he said dryly. "Let's hope your knowledge is sufficient." His tone dripped with condescension, and the subtle hostility wasn't lost on Jasmine, or the other nurses who busied themselves with their tasks while clearly listening in. As Dr. Hayes walked away, Jasmine could feel the weight of judgment hanging in the air. Throughout the day, the disparities in her assignments became more apparent. While her colleagues were given relatively straightforward cases, Jasmine found herself consistently assigned to the most challenging patients and complex procedures. The inequity was unmistakable. Her workload seemed designed to test her endurance and skill, as if her presence alone warranted proving herself over and over again. Yet, even under the weight of these added pressures, Jasmine resolved to rise to the challenge, knowing her actions spoke louder than any words. "Jasmine, could you take Mr. Thompson in room 214? A fellow nurse asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "He's been a bit difficult today." Jasmine nodded, fully aware that difficult was an understatement. Mr. Thompson was notorious for his offensive remarks and had already reduced 2 nurses to tears that week. Yet she approached the task with her usual professionalism, determined to prove her resilience and competence. As Jasmine stepped into the room, she braced herself for the inevitable barrage of hostility. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Thompson snapped the moment he saw her. "I told them I don't want someone like you taking care of me." Jasmine drew a steadying breath, forcing herself to stay calm in the face of his venom. "Mr. Thompson," she said evenly, "I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you, I'm fully qualified to provide your care." Throughout the visit, Mr. Thompson unleashed a steady stream of insults and racial slurs. Despite the torrent of hateful words, Jasmine maintained her composure, focusing on completing her tasks with precision and care. She refused to let his bigotry compromise the quality of her work. When she finally stepped out of the room, she found Dr. Hayes lingering in the hallway, a thin veneer of concern etched across his face. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Rivers?" he asked, his voice carefully measured. "We heard quite a bit of noise." Jasmine met his gaze steadily. Mr. Thompson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me, Doctor? Hayes? For a split second, surprise flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by his usual condescending demeanor. Well, he said with a faint smirk, let's hope you can keep that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we? As Dr. Hayes walked away, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that she had just been subjected to some kind of test, a test she should never have had to face in the first place. The rest of her shift blurred into a series of relentless tasks and subtle indignities. Jasmine found herself triple-checking every detail of her work, not out of doubt in her abilities, but because she knew even the slightest mistake would be amplified and used as ammunition against her. As the day wore on, Jasmine couldn't help but notice how her white colleagues seemed to glide effortlessly through their shifts, chatting and laughing, while she labored under an unfairly heavy workload. The imbalance was stark, but every time she considered speaking up, her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Don't you dare let them see you falter. By the time her shift ended, Jasmine was physically and emotionally exhausted. As she gathered her belongings in the locker room, she caught snippets of a hushed conversation nearby. Can you believe they're making such a big deal about these so-called diversity hires? One nurse whispered, her tone dripping with disdain. I know, the other replied. It's not like they can keep up with the rest of us anyway. Jasmine's hand froze mid-motion, her heart pounding in her chest. The temptation to confront them was overwhelming, to defend herself and her hard-earned accomplishments. But she knew such a confrontation would only serve to validate their biases. Instead, she quietly closed her locker and walked out, her head held high despite the emotional weight pressing down on her. At the bus stop, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sleek black sedan she'd seen before pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Dr. Hayes behind the wheel. Nurse Rivers, he called out, his voice laced with mock concern. Still waiting for the bus? Such a pity. I guess that's all you can manage on a nurse's salary, isn't it? Before Jasmine could reply, he sped off, the engine's growl fading into the distance. The casual cruelty of his words stung, a sharp reminder of the uphill battle she faced each day at Cedar Valley. As Jasmine boarded the bus, her mind churned with a storm of emotions. The excitement and hope she had carried on her first day now felt like distant memories, replaced by a grim resolve. She wasn't just surviving in a hostile environment. She was determined to rise above it. Even as she struggled to process the day's events, a quiet strength began to build within her, a reminder that her worth wasn't defined by the opinions of those around her, and that the road to change was never easy. A quiet voice in the back of Jasmine's mind whispered that something had to give. The question lingered. Would she be the one to break under the mounting pressure? Or would her resolve finally drive a change in the deeply flawed culture of Cedar Valley? Little did Jasmine know, an unexpected ally was about to enter her life. Someone who would shift the balance and shine a light on the long-standing biases that had quietly thrived within the hospital's pristine walls. As the bus rumbled through the dimly lit streets, Jasmine closed her eyes, seeking strength in the memory of her mother's words and the legacy of perseverance that ran through her veins. Tomorrow would bring another battle, but she was ready to face it head-on, no matter the obstacles in her path. The next morning, Jasmine arrived at Cedar Valley with a renewed sense of determination. She had spent the night reflecting on her purpose, reminding herself why she chose this path in the first place: to care for others, regardless of the challenges or biases she faced along the way. As Jasmine approached the nurses' station, she noticed an unusual buzz of activity. Nurses were bustling about, hurriedly preparing a room, and there was a palpable air of anticipation that she hadn't felt before. "What's going on?" Jasmine asked one of her colleagues, Her curiosity piqued. Momentarily forgetting her usual frosty demeanor toward Jasmine, the nurse responded excitedly, "We've got a VIP patient coming in, some bigwig who had a skiing accident. Both arms are broken, from what I've heard." Before Jasmine could ask more, Dr. Hayes appeared, his expression as stern and unyielding as ever. "Nurse Rivers," he said, his tone clipped. "I need you to handle the new admission in room 316, Mr. James Everett. He suffered a serious skiing accident, both arms broken. I expect you to give him the highest level of care and attention." Dr. Hayes's cold, matter-of-fact tone carried an unspoken challenge, but Jasmine nodded resolutely. She wouldn't let his demeanor or the task ahead unsettle her. Jasmine nodded, recognizing the assignment for what it was, another test. "Of course, Dr. Hayes. I'll take care of it right away." As she walked toward room 316, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unusual about this patient. The buzz of activity and air of significance surrounding him hinted at more than just an ordinary case. Stepping into the room, Jasmine was greeted by the sight of a middle-aged man lying in bed, both arms immobilized in heavy casts. Despite his injuries, there was an undeniable presence about him, a quiet authority that immediately caught her attention. "Good morning, Mr. Everett," she said warmly, approaching his bedside. "I'm Nurse Jasmine Rivers, and I'll be looking after you during your stay with us." Mr. Everett turned his head to look at her, his sharp, penetrating gaze meeting hers. "Good morning, Nurse Rivers," he replied, his voice steady and confident despite his condition. "Thank you for your help. I must admit, I didn't expect my little skiing adventure to land me here." As Jasmine began checking his vitals and reviewing his condition, she couldn't ignore the way he observed her every move. His gaze wasn't critical or dismissive, as she had come to expect from many patients. Instead, it carried a thoughtful curiosity that set him apart. "You're very skilled, Nurse Rivers," Mr. Everett commented as she adjusted his IV. "How long have you been working here?" Jasmine paused, momentarily surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "I've been at Cedar Valley for a few weeks now, sir," she replied cautiously. "It's been an enlightening experience so far." Mr. Everett raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Enlightening, you say? That's a very diplomatic answer," he remarked, a note of amusement in his voice. "And has the hospital lived up to its sterling reputation?" Jasmine hesitated, unsure how to navigate the question. Before she could respond, the door swung open, and Dr. Hayes strode in, his demeanor unusually jovial. "Mr. Everett," Dr. Hayes exclaimed, his voice brimming with exaggerated warmth. "I trust Nurse Rivers has been attending to you well. We make sure only our best staff care for our most distinguished patients." The sudden shift in Dr. Hayes's demeanor was striking and uncharacteristic, but Jasmine maintained her composure, silently observing the interaction. Jasmine worked hard to keep her expression neutral, though she couldn't ignore the irony in Dr. Hayes's sudden praise. He had never shown such confidence in her abilities before. Mr. Everett, however, appeared to catch on to the inconsistency. "Indeed, Dr. Hayes," Mr. Everett replied smoothly, his gaze flicking between the doctor and Jasmine. "Nurse Rivers has been outstanding. I was just asking her about her experiences here at Cedar Valley." Dr. Hayes's smile faltered momentarily before he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm sure she'll tell you it's been nothing but excellent," he said with a saccharine tone. "We pride ourselves on fostering an inclusive and supportive environment here at Cedar Valley." Jasmine felt a surge of anger at his blatant hypocrisy, but she maintained her professionalism, her face a calm mask. Mr. Everett, however, seemed to sense the tension beneath the surface. "Is that so?" he said thoughtfully, his gaze resting on Jasmine. Well, I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand during my stay. As Dr. Hayes launched into a detailed explanation of Mr. Everett's treatment plan, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just unfolded. The way Mr. Everett observed her and the pointed nature of his questions, it was as if he could see beyond the polished facade of Cedar Valley's sterling reputation. Over the next few days, Jasmine found herself spending more time with Mr. Everett than with any other patient. Despite his injuries, he was alert and engaging, often asking her questions about her work and her background. Unlike many others she encountered at the hospital, Mr. Everett seemed genuinely interested in her responses. Not once did she detect a trace of prejudice or judgment in his demeanor. One afternoon, as Jasmine carefully changed his bandages, her attention was drawn to a hushed conversation just outside the room. "I don't care what Dr. Hayes says," a nurse's voice hissed, sharp and venomous. "I don't trust that Rivers woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do?" "I know," another voice agreed, their tone equally conspiratorial. "But we can't say anything. They'll just accuse us of being biased." The words struck Jasmine like a blow, making her blood run cold. She took a steadying breath, focusing on her work as she felt a storm of emotions building inside her. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly as she finished adjusting Mr. Everett's bandages, the weight of constant suspicion and mistrust pressing heavily on her. Mr. Everett, ever observant, noticed her unease. "Is everything all right, Nurse Rivers?" he asked, his tone gentle yet probing. Jasmine forced a small smile. "Of course, Mr. Everett. Just concentrating on getting these bandages exactly right." For a moment, Mr. Everett was silent, his sharp eyes studying her face. Then he spoke, his words slow and deliberate. "You know," he said, "I've always believed that a person's true character is revealed not by how they treat their superiors, but by how they treat those they think are beneath them." Jasmine looked up, startled by the pointed nature of his remark. Mr. Everett held her gaze, a knowing expression in his eyes. "I've seen a lot in my time, Nurse Rivers," he continued, "and I can tell you, the view from this bed has been illuminating." Before Jasmine could respond, the door swung open, and Dr. Hayes entered the room, effectively cutting their conversation short. As Jasmine left, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Everett was more than just another VIP patient. His words and demeanor suggested a deeper understanding of the dynamics at Cedar Valley, and for the first time since she started working there, Jasmine felt a glimmer of hope. Little did she know, Mr. Everett's presence would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the very core of Cedar Valley's culture, exposing the entrenched biases lurking beneath its polished surface. In the days that followed, Jasmine's isolation at the hospital deepened. The initial coldness from her colleagues had given way to open hostility. Whispered remarks and pointed glances followed her everywhere. Meanwhile, Dr. Hayes, emboldened by the absence of accountability for his actions, became increasingly overt in his attempts to undermine her. One morning, as Jasmine was reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station, Dr. Hayes approached her with a towering stack of files. "Nurse Rivers," he said, his voice dripping with feigned concern, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly challenging. I trust you're up to the task." Jasmine glanced at the towering stack of files, instantly recognizing it as nearly double the workload of her colleagues. She met Dr. Hayes's gaze with quiet determination, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. "Of course, Dr. Hayes," she replied calmly. "I'll get started right away." As Dr. Hayes walked away, a faint smirk curled at the edges of his lips. Jasmine caught his muttered words as he disappeared down the hall. Let's see how she handles this. The day became a whirlwind of endless tasks as Jasmine moved from one challenging case to another, barely pausing to take a breath. Each patient seemed more demanding than the last, many with complex medical conditions or difficult temperaments. Despite the relentless pace, Jasmine refused to let her standards drop. She approached each case with unwavering professionalism, even as exhaustion began to creep in. But the constant pressure was wearing her down, both physically and emotionally. As she hurried to respond to yet another call light, Jasmine caught snippets of a hushed conversation between two nurses nearby. "Can you believe they're letting her handle all these critical cases?" one nurse said, her tone heavy with disdain. "It's like they're just waiting for her to mess up." "I know," the other replied, her voice quieter but tinged with reluctant admiration. "But you've got to admit, it's impressive how she keeps going. I'd have cracked by now." Jasmine felt a surge of conflicting emotions. The anger and hurt from realizing her colleagues not only recognized the injustice, but were also quietly watching to see if she would fail, were almost unbearable. Yet she pushed those feelings aside, focusing instead on her patients and the task at hand. Throughout the day, Jasmine found herself drawn to Mr. Everett's room more frequently. Unlike the rest of the hospital, his room had become a kind of refuge, a space where she could momentarily catch her breath and feel, if only for a fleeting moment, that someone truly saw her worth. "Nurse Rivers," Mr. Everett greeted her warmly as she entered his room for a routine check. "You look exhausted. Is everything all right?" Jasmine forced a faint smile. "Just a busy day, Mr. Everett. Nothing I can't manage." Mr. Everett studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes reflecting genuine concern. "You know," he said gently, "there's a big difference between merely managing something and truly thriving. From what I've observed, you're more than capable of the latter." His words, though well-meaning, only underscored the stark disparity between the respect he showed her and the treatment she endured from the rest of the staff. Jasmine felt a lump rise in her throat as the weight of her isolation threatened to overwhelm her. "Thank you, Mr. Everett," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I appreciate your kindness." As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her in her tracks. "Nurse Rivers," he said, his tone calm but imbued with quiet authority. "Remember, true strength sometimes lies in knowing when to speak up." Jasmine left the room, his words echoing in her mind. As she made her way back to the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the feeling that a shift was on the horizon. Little did she know the following day would bring events that would push her to her limits and ignite a confrontation that had been building since her first day at Cedar Valley. The next morning, Jasmine arrived to find the hospital in a state of palpable tension. Whispers filled the halls, rumors circulating about a high-stakes emergency surgery scheduled for later that day. The operation was set to be observed by members of the hospital board and other prominent figures, adding to the already charged atmosphere. As Jasmine began her rounds, the nervous energy around her was impossible to ignore. Doctors and nurses moved with an edge of urgency, their expressions betraying the pressure of the impending operation. Midway through her morning duties, Dr. Hayes approached her. The glint in his eye sent an immediate wave of unease through her. "Nurse Rivers," Dr. Hayes said, his tone carefully measured. "We need you to assist in the emergency surgery this afternoon. It's a critical case, and I trust you're prepared to handle it." Jasmine felt a mix of surprise and skepticism flood through her. Being asked to assist in such a high-profile operation was typically a sign of trust and recognition. Yet, coming from Dr. Hayes, she couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that there was more to this than met the eye. "Of course, Dr. Hayes," she replied evenly, keeping her voice composed. "I'll be ready." As he walked away, Jasmine overheard him mutter to a colleague, "Let's see how she handles the pressure." This should be interesting. The hours leading up to the surgery were a whirlwind of preparation. Jasmine immersed herself in her work, meticulously double and triple checking every detail to ensure she was fully ready for any challenge that might arise. When the time came, she scrubbed in alongside the surgical team, her heart pounding with a mix of determination and unease. Glancing around, she noticed the wary glances from some of the staff, skepticism evident in their expressions. Jasmine took a deep breath, her mother's words echoing in her mind, "Don't you dare let them see you falter." As the operation began, the tension in the room was almost tangible. With senior staff and board members observing, every action carried added weight. Despite the pressure, Jasmine remained laser-focused. Her movements were precise, her responses swift, and she anticipated the surgeon's needs before they voiced them. Her years of training and dedication shone through with every step. But as the surgery progressed, Jasmine noticed something unsettling. Dr. Hayes, usually composed and assured, seemed hesitant. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to make a critical incision. In that split second, Jasmine realized he was about to make a mistake, one that could have catastrophic consequences. Without hesitation, she spoke up. "Dr. Hayes," she said, her voice calm but firm, "perhaps we should consider approaching from a different angle. The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Jasmine, the weight of their scrutiny pressing down on her. Dr. Hayes turned to Jasmine, surprise and anger flickering across his face. For a tense moment, she thought he might dismiss her suggestion outright. But then, almost reluctantly, he gave a slight nod and adjusted his technique, following her recommendation. As the surgery continued, it became evident that Jasmine's intervention had likely prevented a life-threatening error. By the time the operation concluded successfully, the atmosphere in the room was charged. Jasmine could feel the weight of many gazes upon her, some filled with newfound respect, while others, including Dr. Hayes's, brimmed with barely restrained hostility. As the team began cleaning up, Dr. Hayes turned to her, his voice low and ominous. "Nurse Rivers," he said, his tone cutting, "I need to speak with you in private." "Now." Jasmine followed him out of the operating room, her heart pounding. She knew she had done the right thing, but the consequences of her actions were impossible to predict. As they entered a private room, she was startled to realize it was Mr. Everett's room. In the intensity of the operation, she had forgotten he was still a patient in the hospital. Dr. Hayes, however, seemed too consumed by his fury to notice or care about their surroundings. As soon as the door closed, he rounded on her, his face flushed with anger. "How dare you question my judgment in there?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot for such insubordination." Jasmine stood her ground, her voice steady but firm. "Dr. Hayes, I was doing my job, the patient's safety." "Your job?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Your job is to follow orders, not to think you know better than your superiors. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious institution like Cedar Valley. You're here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real talent or knowledge." His tirade escalated, his words growing more openly hostile with each passing moment. Jasmine felt a surge of anger and despair rise within her. Everything she had endured, every slight, every whispered remark, seemed to pale in comparison to this overt display of prejudice. Just as she opened her mouth to respond, a firm voice cut through the room, halting Dr. Hayes mid-sentence. "Dr. Hayes," Mr. Everett said, his tone calm but commanding, carrying a weight neither Jasmine nor Dr. Hayes had heard before. "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Both Jasmine and Dr. Hayes turned in surprise. Mr. Everett was sitting upright in his bed, his expression composed yet radiating controlled anger. Mr. Everett, Dr. Hayes stammered, his face draining of color as the gravity of the situation began to dawn on him. I didn't realize you were awake. My apologies for disturbing you." "Oh, I'm very much awake, Doctor." "Hayes," Mr. Everett replied coldly, his eyes narrowing, "and I've been awake for quite some time, long enough to witness the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have been treating Nurse Rivers." Jasmine stood frozen, stunned by what she was hearing. The quiet, unassuming patient she had grown to respect now exuded an air of authority so powerful it filled the room. "Mr. Everett," Dr. Hayes began, his voice trembling, "I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Mr. Everett interjected sharply, cutting him off. "What I've observed during my time here is a clear and consistent pattern of discrimination and harassment. And let me be very clear. It ends now." As Mr. Everett spoke, both Jasmine and Dr. Hayes began to grasp the full weight of his words. This was no ordinary patient. The way he held himself, the command in his voice, it was clear Mr. Everett held significant influence. Who are you?" Dr. Hayes asked, his earlier confidence utterly shattered. Mr. Everett's smile was cold and devoid of warmth. "Someone who has the power to decide this hospital's future," he said evenly. "And right now, Dr. Hayes, I'm finding it very difficult to support an institution that allows blatant racism and unprofessional behavior to flourish." The weight of the situation sank in like a stone. For the first time since she had started at Cedar Valley, Jasmine felt an overwhelming mix of emotions. Relief that someone had finally acknowledged the injustices she had endured, anger at the treatment she had suffered, and, most importantly, a glimmer of hope that things might finally change. Little did anyone in that room know. This confrontation was the spark that would ignite a chain of events, shaking Cedar Valley Medical Center to its very foundation. Long-buried prejudices were about to be exposed, and a reckoning that had been deferred for too long was now inevitable. The tension in Mr. Everett's room was palpable as the weight of his words settled over them. Dr. Hayes, his face pale and drawn, struggled to regain his composure. Jasmine stood silently, her thoughts swirling with disbelief and relief at the sudden shift in power. Now, fully upright in his bed, Mr. Everett fixed Dr. Hayes with a piercing gaze. "I think it's time we had a frank discussion about the culture of this hospital, don't you?" Before Dr. Hayes could respond, a knock at the door interrupted. A nervous-looking nurse peered in. "Doctor, Hayes, the hospital administrator needs to see you. It's urgent." Dr. Hayes glanced between Mr. Everett and the nurse, clearly torn. Finally, he gave a stiff nod. "We'll continue this discussion later," he said curtly, his voice barely masking his frustration. He turned to Jasmine. "Nurse Rivers, you're dismissed for now." As Dr. Hayes hurried out of the room, Jasmine found herself alone with Mr. Everett. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken thoughts. "Nurse Rivers," Mr. Everett said at last, his tone softer now, "I believe it's time I properly introduced myself." He paused, his gaze steady. "My name is Thomas Everett, and I'm the CEO of Horizon Healthcare, one of the largest healthcare networks in the country." Jasmine's eyes widened in shock. Horizon Healthcare was a giant in the medical world, known for its vast influence and resources. Suddenly, his earlier remarks about having the power to shape the hospital's future made perfect sense. "Mr. Everett, Jasmine began, unsure of how to respond. "Please, sit," Mr. Everett said, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. "I think we have a lot to discuss." For the next hour, Mr. Everett shared his observations and experiences during his unplanned stay at Cedar Valley. His skiing accident had brought him to the hospital, but what he had witnessed during his time there had uncovered deeper issues. "I came here expecting nothing more than excellent medical care," Mr. Everett explained, his tone measured but firm. "Instead, I've seen a culture of discrimination and unprofessionalism that goes against everything I stand for as a leader in healthcare." He detailed the behaviors he had observed, the microaggressions, the subtle yet pervasive biases, and the outright hostility directed toward Jasmine. "This isn't just about you, Nurse Rivers," he continued. "This reflects a systemic issue that can't be ignored." Jasmine listened intently, her emotions a mix of validation and determination. For the first time, someone with real power had not only seen the injustices she faced, but was also willing to address them. "Your experience, Nurse Rivers, is unfortunately not unique," Mr. Everett said, his voice carrying a mix of anger and determination. "But it is unacceptable, and it ends now." As they spoke, Jasmine felt a weight begin to lift from her shoulders. For the first time since she had started at Cedar Valley, she felt truly seen and heard. Mr. Everett listened attentively as she recounted her experiences, his expression growing graver with each revelation. "Thank you for your honesty, Nurse Rivers," Mr. Everett said when she finished. "Your resilience in the face of such adversity is admirable, but this cannot be about individual perseverance anymore. It's time for systemic change." Just then, there was a knock at the door, and the hospital administrator entered looking visibly flustered. "Mr. Everett," she began, her voice trembling, "I understand there have been some concerns about our hospital's practices. I want to assure you we take these matters very seriously." Mr. Everett raised an eyebrow, his gaze sharp. "Do you?" he asked, his tone cutting. "Because from what I've observed, the only thing being taken seriously here is the preservation of an outdated and discriminatory status quo." The administrator paled, clearly caught off guard by the direct criticism. I'm not sure I understand. We have diversity initiatives in place." "Initiatives are not enough," Mr. Everett interrupted, his voice firm. "What you need is a complete overhaul of this hospital's culture, and it starts at the top." Over the next few hours, Mr. Everett laid out a comprehensive plan for change. He called for an immediate investigation into discriminatory practices at Cedar Valley, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a restructuring of the hospital's hiring and promotion policies. "And as for Dr. Hayes," Mr. Everett continued, his tone hardening, "I expect his behavior to be thoroughly investigated." His actions today were not only unprofessional, but discriminatory and dangerous to patient care. The administrator, realizing the seriousness of the situation, nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Everett. We'll begin implementing these changes immediately." As word of Mr. Everett's true identity and the sweeping changes he was demanding spread through the hospital, the atmosphere in Cedar Valley shifted dramatically. The halls buzzed with a mix of fear, anticipation, and for some, hope. Jasmine, still processing everything that had happened, suddenly found herself at the center of attention. Colleagues who had previously ignored or undermined her now approached her. Some offered awkward apologies, while others sought her perspective on the impending changes. As Jasmine's shift ended, she decided to visit Mr. Everett one last time. She found him sitting up in bed, looking tired but content. "Nurse Rivers," he greeted her with a warm smile. "I hope you don't mind, but I've recommended you for a position on the newly formed Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your experiences and insights will be crucial as we work to transform Cedar Valley." A wave of emotion swept over Jasmine, gratitude, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. "Thank you, Mr. Everett," she said, her voice thick with feeling, "for everything." Mr. Everett shook his head. "No, Nurse Rivers, thank you. Your courage and professionalism in the face of adversity have been nothing short of inspiring. You've reminded me why I pursued healthcare in the first place, to make a real difference in people's lives." As Jasmine left the hospital that evening, she couldn't help but feel that a new chapter was beginning, not just for her, but for Cedar Valley as a whole. The path ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, but for the first time since she started working there, Jasmine felt a genuine sense of hope for the future. Little did she know, the changes sparked that day would ripple far beyond the hospital's walls, influencing the healthcare industry as a whole. The story of a determined nurse and an unexpectedly influential patient was about to become a beacon of transformation on a scale neither could have anticipated. The following days at Cedar Valley were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The revelation of Mr. Everett's true identity and his demands for reform had sent shockwaves through the institution. The hospital's once immaculate facade had cracked, exposing the deeply ingrained issues that had festered beneath the surface for years. Early Monday morning, Jasmine arrived at the hospital to find a scene of chaos. News vans lined the street outside, reporters jostling for statements from anyone willing to speak. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Staff huddled in small groups, their whispered conversations tinged with anxiety and speculation. As Jasmine approached the nurses' station, she noticed Dr. Hayes being escorted toward the administrative offices by security. Their eyes met briefly, and in his gaze, Jasmine saw a mixture of anger and fear. Moments later, he disappeared down the hall, flanked by the security team. "Jasmine?" a voice called out. She turned to see Sarah, one of the nurses who had previously been distant and cold toward her, approaching with an awkward smile. "I just wanted to say," Sarah began hesitantly, "I'm sorry for how I've treated you. I didn't realize." Jasmine nodded, accepting the apology with a polite smile, though unsure of how to respond. Before she could say anything, the hospital's PA system crackled to life. All staff are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory. When Jasmine arrived at the packed auditorium, she found a seat near the back, keenly aware of the curious glances and hushed whispers that followed her. At the front of the room, she spotted Mr. Everett, now dressed in a tailored suit despite his arm casts. He was speaking quietly with the hospital administrator and several other official-looking individuals. As the room settled, Mr. Everett stepped up to the podium. His commanding presence immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room, silencing the whispers and shifting focus to him. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "For those who don't know me, I am Thomas Everett, CEO of Horizon Healthcare. Over the past week, I've been a patient here at Cedar Valley, recovering from a skiing accident. During this time, I had the unique opportunity to observe the day-to-day operations and culture of this hospital." He paused, his sharp gaze sweeping across the audience. "What I witnessed was deeply troubling," he said, his tone firm. "I saw a culture of discrimination, bias, and unprofessional behavior, practices that have no place in modern healthcare." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some staff shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement, their expressions solemn. "Let me be perfectly clear," Mr. Everett continued, his voice rising slightly to emphasize his point. "The events I witnessed, particularly the treatment of Nurse Jasmine Rivers, are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a systemic problem that has been allowed to fester for far too long." Jasmine felt the weight of the room's attention shift to her. Every gaze seemed to land on her, but she sat up straighter, meeting their looks with quiet composure and dignity. Mr. Everett continued, his voice steady and resolute. He outlined the immediate changes that would take effect: a comprehensive investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, and a complete overhaul of the hospital's hiring and promotion processes. Furthermore, Mr. Everett added, his tone sharpening, those found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior will face serious consequences. This includes Dr. Leonard Hayes, who has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct. The announcement rippled through the auditorium, sparking another wave of murmurs. Jasmine could see the range of reactions. Some of Dr. Hayes's longtime supporters appeared visibly upset, while others looked relieved, as though justice were finally being served. I understand that these changes may be difficult for some of you, Mr. Everett continued, his voice softening slightly but still firm. Change often is. But let me be absolutely clear. This is not just about moral responsibility. It's about providing the best possible care for our patients. A diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace leads to better outcomes for everyone. As Mr. Everett concluded his speech, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Then, with a small but unmistakable smile, he made a final announcement that sent a jolt through the crowd. Lastly, he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium, I want to introduce the person who will be at the forefront of these changes. Nurse Jasmine Rivers has agreed to take on the role of Chief Diversity Officer at Cedar Valley. Her experiences and insights will be invaluable as we work together to transform this institution. Jasmine felt a flood of emotions, shock, pride, and nervousness, rush through her as applause began to fill the room. She had not expected this announcement, having only discussed joining the Diversity and Inclusion Committee with Mr. Everett. As she made her way to the front of the room at Mr. Everett's beckoning, Jasmine caught glimpses of her colleagues' reactions. Their faces displayed a mix of emotions, surprise, respect, and in some cases lingering resentment. Standing at the podium, Jasmine took a deep breath, steadying herself before addressing the room. Thank you, Mr. Everett, she began, her voice clear and composed. To everyone here, I want to say this. I stand before you not as an adversary, but as a colleague who believes in the potential of Cedar Valley and in every one of you. The road ahead won't be easy, but I am committed to working with all of you to create a hospital where every staff member feels valued, and every patient receives the highest standard of care, regardless of their background. As Jasmine spoke, she saw her words resonating. Some staff members nodded in agreement, while others appeared thoughtful. Even those who had been openly hostile to her in the past seemed to be listening with genuine attention. After the meeting, Jasmine found herself surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations, apologies, and tentative gestures of reconciliation. The atmosphere in the hospital had shifted noticeably. While tension and uncertainty remained, there was also a growing sense of hope and possibility. As the day wore on, Jasmine worked tirelessly alongside Mr. Everett and the hospital administration to begin implementing the promised reforms. The work was both exhausting and exhilarating. For the first time since she had started at Cedar Valley, Jasmine felt like she was truly making a difference. That evening, as she prepared to leave the hospital, she saw Mr. Everett waiting near the exit. Nurse Rivers, he greeted her with a warm smile, then added with a playful tone, or should I say, Chief Diversity Officer Rivers. How are you holding up? Jasmine let out a tired laugh. It's been quite a day, Mr. Everett. Honestly, I'm still processing everything. Mr. Everett nodded, his expression understanding. I know it's a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I have full confidence in your ability to lead these changes. Your resilience and integrity in the face of adversity are exactly what Cedar Valley needs right now. As they walked out of the hospital together, Mr. Everett's expression turned serious. You should know, he said, what's happening here at Cedar Valley is just the beginning. I plan to implement similar changes across all Horizon healthcare facilities. Your story, Jasmine, has the potential to inspire a revolution in how we approach diversity and inclusion in healthcare. Jasmine felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but instead of feeling burdened, she felt empowered. "I'm ready for the challenge, Mr. Everett," she said confidently. "Together, we can create real, lasting change." As they parted ways, Jasmine reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just a matter of days. What had once felt like an isolating, uphill battle had now transformed into a movement. A chance to reshape not just Cedar Valley, but potentially the entire healthcare industry. The road ahead would be far from easy. There would be obstacles, resistance, and those unwilling to embrace change. But as Jasmine turned to look back at the hospital, she felt a surge of determination. This was no longer just a job, it was her calling. A chance to ensure that no other healthcare professional would have to endure the challenges she had faced. With renewed purpose, Jasmine walked into the evening, ready to tackle whatever the next day might bring. The transformation of Cedar Valley had begun, and with it, a new chapter in the fight for equality and inclusion in healthcare. In the months following Mr. Everett's revelations, Cedar Valley Medical Center underwent a dramatic and much-needed transformation. Under Jasmine's leadership as Chief Diversity Officer, and with Mr. Everett's unwavering support, the once toxic culture began shifting toward inclusivity and respect. Mandatory diversity and inclusion training, initially met with skepticism and resistance, gradually began to change minds and open hearts. The hospital's hiring and promotion policies were overhauled, creating pathways for fairer and more equitable opportunities. Dr. Hayes, following a thorough investigation, was dismissed from his position, a clear signal that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. As news of Cedar Valley's transformation spread, Jasmine became a sought-after speaker at medical conferences and diversity seminars, sharing her story and the strategies that had worked to bring about real change. Exactly 1 year after the day of Mr. Everett's intervention, Jasmine found herself standing before a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference. Jasmine began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "A year ago, I was a nurse on the verge of giving up. Today, I stand before you as living proof that change is possible, that one voice can spark a movement." She shared the story of Cedar Valley's transformation, candidly recounting the challenges they had faced while celebrating the victories. The lives impacted, the minds changed, and the culture reshaped. After the conference, Mr. Everett, now fully recovered from his injuries, approached Jasmine with a warm smile. "Jasmine," he greeted her, "you've come a long way from the nurse I met a year ago." They talked about the progress at Cedar Valley and its ripple effects across the healthcare industry. Mr. Everett shared that several other hospitals in the Horizon Healthcare Network had begun implementing similar initiatives inspired by Jasmine's leadership. "You know, Jasmine," Mr. Everett said thoughtfully, "when I checked into Cedar Valley after my skiing accident, I never could have imagined the journey it would set in motion. You've not only transformed Cedar Valley but also reignited my passion for this work." As Jasmine prepared to return to Cedar Valley, she reflected on her incredible journey. From an isolated, frustrated nurse to a leader and changemaker, she had come so far. The work was far from over, but Jasmine felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. Arriving back at Cedar Valley, Jasmine was greeted by Sarah, once a cold colleague, now a strong ally. The hospital buzzed with new energy, staff members collaborating and communicating in ways they never had before. In the main lobby, Jasmine paused before a new mural depicting a diverse group of healthcare professionals working together. A plaque beneath it read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." As she settled into her office, ready to tackle the challenges ahead, Jasmine smiled. The transformation of Cedar Valley was just the beginning. The real work, changing hearts, minds, and entire systems, was ongoing. And she was ready for it all, committed to creating a truly inclusive healthcare system, one day at a time. What moment in Jasmine's journey resonated with you the most? Was it her perseverance in the face of discrimination, or perhaps Mr. Everett's pivotal intervention? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, consider subscribing to my channel. I pour my heart into crafting these meaningful stories for you, and your support means the world to me. Thank you for being a part of this journey.